So as I said, I'm part of the Liquity team and also a Beanstalk user, and I actually managed to ape in just a few days before the exploit happened. But yeah, we won't dwell on that today because I wanted to talk to you two guys, Publius and Max from Beanstalk. So before we proceed, or before I proceed with the overview of what we'll be talking about, do you just want to shortly introduce yourself?
Sure. We're Publius. We're the founders of Beanstalk, the initial deployers of Beanstalk, but at this point are just a part of the very vibrant and active Beanstalk community. So since Beanstalk was launched just under 9 months ago on ETH mainnet, there's been a flourishing growth of contributors and community around Beanstalk. And, at this point, whereas originally it was, just us, at this point, there's a whole set of people working on and around Beanstalk. And to a large extent, that's why, despite the attack that happened almost 2 weeks ago now, Beanstalk, there's still a path forward for Beanstalk because the community has made it very clear that there's, this is something worth fighting for. So I know you asked more about us, but we tend to identify very much with the Beanstalk community, and happy to talk more about us if that's interesting.
Yeah, I totally get that. I noticed from the Discord that it's really very engaged and very forward thinking and also positive. So that's awesome to see. For the Liquity guys, or basically for everyone, I want to give some context on why we are having this space and what we'll be talking about. So Beanstalk integrated LUSD, that's a Liquity stablecoin, about a month ago. And usually when this happens, we have some kind of coordinated marketing effort, like AMA, how-to guide, etc., which was not really the case this time. Why? Basically, because on one hand, Beanstalk surprised us a little bit by integrating LUSD on their own. They didn't even get in touch with us, which is actually great. It's awesome and very much appreciated, and something we want to see more of. But we couldn't really get our marketing efforts up in time. And on the other hand, the other reason is because just shortly after being integrated, of course, the governance exploit happened. So today we kind of want to make up for it a little bit and talk about, on one hand, why Beanstalk chose LUSD or Liquity, what ideas they might have to expand on that partnership. And then also we'll touch upon the exploit and, of course, the fundraiser, aptly named Barn Raise, which goes live on Monday. So to kick things off, do you want to give a brief intro on Beanstalk, what it is, what it does, and then I can do the same for Liquity?
Sure. So Beanstalk is a credit-based stablecoin issuer. What does that mean? So whereas the vast majority of other stablecoin protocols, like Liquity, use some version of collateral, and in particular, as we'll talk about in Liquity's case, you guys use very decentralized collateral, which is wonderful. But nonetheless, across crypto, there's a shortage of collateral. And that collateral shortage manifests itself in high borrowing costs for stablecoins. And so fundamentally, the goal of Beanstalk is to be able to issue stablecoins without any collateral requirements whatsoever. And in doing so, the supply of beans, the Beanstalk stablecoin, is untethered to the amount of available collateral because it doesn't require any collateral. And therefore, in theory, Beanstalk should be able to drive the borrowing costs for stablecoins down to zero effectively over time. Now, credit-based or non-collateralized stablecoins prior to Beanstalk. There have been a ton of different attempts, Basis Cash, ESD, DSD, the list goes on. But they all had various economic issues, I guess with the exception of Basis, you could argue, because they didn't launch. But they all had various economic issues that resulted in the price collapsing, and the protocols were unable to keep their stablecoin at their peg. Beanstalk, while it's had a lot of volatility since it launched, in its almost 9-month history prior to being attacked, Beanstalk did demonstrate a pretty strong ability to regularly cross the bean price above and below its peg of $1. And over time, the hope is that beans will start to be a major liquidity provider across DeFi. And the reason for that structurally is that whereas the vast majority of other stablecoins have some sort of negative carry cost associated with them, the credit-based model facilitates the distribution of bean seigniorage in a somewhat arbitrary fashion, whereby, according to the rules of Beanstalk, half of all bean mints go to governance token holders. And so if you hold beans, you can deposit your beans in the silo, which is the Beanstalk DAO, and receive governance token stock. And stock entitles you to a portion of all future bean mints. And so, in short, just holding the beans in the silo is how the beans receive positive carry. Now, holding your beans is one thing, but in practice, the protocol would much prefer that you use your beans to provide liquidity. And the deeper the liquidity for beans, the more stable it is in the grand scheme of things. And so and we'll talk about why the Liquity integration was so appealing, but just at a high level, many of the upgrades that the DAO made and voted to make on Beanstalk over the past couple of months were to generalize the silo, such that whereas when Beanstalk was originally deployed, the only assets that could be deposited in the silo to earn this interest, to earn the positive carry, to earn the bean seigniorage, were beans and LP tokens for the Bean ETH Uniswap pool. But as we know, DeFi doesn't just run on Ethereum, and it doesn't just run on Uniswap v2, right? And so the concept is to continue to generalize the silo and to continue to generalize Beanstalk such that people can interface and interoperate with other protocols and other assets through Beanstalk and earn positive carry through Beanstalk, whether they're providing liquidity in the form of beans or, in the case of LUSD holders, providing liquidity to the Bean ETH pool and depositing those LP tokens in the silo. The concept is Beanstalk creates a very symbiotic relationship between other protocols, and demonstrating that proof of concept with Liquity was something that was in the beginning stages of happening prior to the attack. So a little bit of a long-winded answer for you there, but hopefully that's some helpful color.
Yeah, that was awesome. And before I dive into Liquity, I just would have a comment and question.
Please.
Regarding the fluctuations of the price, I think it went down to 0.25 and up to 4 USD, if I'm not afraid. But it always returned back to back, which was quite fascinating to behold. And over time, those fluctuations became smaller and smaller. So I think that's proof that the protocol really works as intended. One question about the silo or about the new assets. Does that mean that you will be able to add any whitelisted assets, or how does the selection work?
So there's a couple things. One is the state of Beanstalk prior to the attack, and then there's what Beanstalk could facilitate in the future. So prior to the attack, Beanstalk could accept, based on a whitelist, arbitrary ERC20 tokens. And so that included beans and various LP tokens. However, the concept is that the silo could be further generalized to accept not just ERC20 tokens, and more generally, to also facilitate the distribution of yield from other protocols in addition to Bean seigniorage. So one of the things that happened, shortly prior to the attack was that the Bean 3 curve pool was added to the curve gauge, and therefore people could, in theory, deposit their curve LP tokens in the curve gauge. They could deposit them on convex, or they could deposit them in the silo. However, in theory, and this was an update that was being worked on actively at Beanstalk Farms prior to the attack, the silo can facilitate the distribution of yield from other protocols. So you'd be able to deposit your convex Bean 3 curve or your convex Bean LUSD tokens in the silo and receive Bean seigniorage in addition to seigniorage from other protocols, if that makes sense. And that's generalizable. So the concept is to make the silo super frictionless as possible and as attractive to liquidity providers as possible.
It sounds very, very enticing indeed. So before we continue with exploring this, I just wanted to give a brief intro on Liquity for the Beanstalk audience. So,
please, that would be wonderful.
So Liquity is a borrowing protocol which launched on Ethereum about a year ago, a bit more than a year ago. And it is similar to Maker. That's the easiest comparison I can make. Meaning you can supply an asset which acts as collateral and can then borrow against it. Borrowing in this case means you are minting a stablecoin, in our case LUSD. However, we did make quite a few improvements on that concept. For example, we are the cheapest way to borrow against ETH. So we just charge a 0.5% fee and nothing else. There is no repayment fee. There is nothing else apart from that 0.5% fee. Meaning, if you borrow 10,000 LUSD, you pay $500, and that's it. Very suitable for long-term loans. Capital efficiency is another topic because you can borrow up to 90% of your collateral value. And usually that's just around the 75% range. So that's quite different. And the last point I want to mention, something that you mentioned already as well, is the emphasis we put on decentralization and censorship resistance. So to maximize it, we only use ETH as collateral. We also do not run a front end ourselves. So of all the dozens of front ends which are out there, all are run either by community members or by friendly protocols. And last but not least, I need to say that Liquity is immutable. That means it cannot be changed by anyone. We don't have no admin keys, no way to influence it. There is no governance. And basically the only way to take it down is to kill Ethereum itself. So that's something that was very close to our hearts and to our ethos, so to say, when building it. And we're happy that it's working as intended so far.
Fabulous. And a lot of those qualities, like immutability, and once you take the one-time cost to mint the LUSD, there's no additional carrying costs. Those were two of the main things that made Liquity particularly attractive from our perspective to incorporate early on into Beanstalk. And when you consider that the collateral that Liquity uses is Ethereum, as decentralized as it gets in practice on the Ethereum network, that was also something very attractive, right? So for a lot of different reasons, although in Beanstalk's case, it required on-chain governance and the ability to upgrade itself, it's very nice that Liquity didn't require that. And that's one of the things that made it a low-risk choice to try to integrate with Beanstalk early on.
Yeah, and I did hear that you were a big fan of MakerDAO or a user of their borrowing functionality, I think at least. So was that the factor itself that we are a borrowing protocol, or was the decentralization more of a factor?
much more the decentralization. In practice, the idea for the Liquity integration was a long time coming. One of our longtime community members who then started working at Beanstalk Farms, they Syncubate, who's fabulous. They have
Shout
all
out to
sorts of
Sync.
shout out to Sync. They have so many incredible ideas, and one of their best ideas and earliest ideas was that Liquity would be a wonderful integration with Beanstalk because of how well aligned it was with the ethos of decentralization and permissionlessness. And it was really great timing that as the silo whitelist happened in, I think, January, if I recall correctly, the first pool that was added was Bean 3 Curve. But then as Beanstalk Farms was trying to figure out what other pools to add, that aligned with the Liquity Stability Pool reward halving. And Syncubate had a wonderful idea that Beanstalk Farms should try to add a Bean LUSD pool to the silo, or try to get it added prior to that happening. Now, in practice, the timing wasn't exactly perfect. I think it was a couple days off, but the idea was certainly there, and it seemed that there started to be some movement of capital from the stability pool into the Bean LUSD pool and into the silo. So it was still a small pool at the time of the attack compared to the other two pools that Beanstalk had at the time. But nonetheless, it was starting to grow pretty quickly and much quicker than the other two pools had grown originally. So it was very exciting to see.
Definitely, I think things were really moving into the right direction, and I personally was also very excited about it. So hoping we can replicate that again in a couple of weeks or more in a month, I guess. But when I was going over your documentation and roadmap, etc., I also found a very interesting feature and also pinged Max about it. This is the option to do a one-click transaction, basically going from the ETH in your wallet. You could borrow on Liquity LUSD and directly deposit into the silo. So that's very neat, in my opinion. Could you tell a thing or two about that?
Sure. So this is an upgrade that has been a long time coming to Beanstalk that was being called the Farm, which is the ability to interact with other protocols through Beanstalk. So one of the currently one of the common transactions that people do or interact with Beanstalk is to harvest their pods, the debt that they lent to Beanstalk that are now redeemable for beans, and immediately deposit those beans in the silo, either as LP tokens or as beans. And the concept is Beanstalk manages all of that for you. You can just harvest and go into deposited beans, or harvest and go into deposited currently Bean ETH LP, but with the farm, it could have been any of the LP tokens in a single transaction. However, the farm is a lot cooler than that. The idea, as you were saying, was in theory you could do things like harvest your pods into beans, sell those beans into ETH, deposit that ETH in a Liquity trove, mint LUSD against that Liquity trove, add the LUSD to an LUSD bean pool, and then deposit those LP tokens in the silo. And if there was also LUSD bean in the curve gauge, then in theory you could, in that same transaction, take those LP tokens, deposit it in Convex for boosted curve rewards via Convex, and then deposit the Convex bean LUSD into the silo. So you could do all of that in a single transaction. And that, believe it or not, that was supposed to, I think the bid for that was going to be ready for proposal, in a week or two prior or after the hack or attack. So, that type of cool functionality is in the not too distant future, regardless, once Beanstalk is back up and running.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get there. And I just want to mention for better understanding that when you deposit into the pool, the beans which you earn automatically go to the bean pool as well. So they kind of auto compound automatically. Is my understanding correct on that?
So the way bean seigniorage is distributed at the moment is that half of all new beans minted go to paying off debt, go to paying off pods, and half go to stockholders. And the beans that are paid to stockholders are immediately and automatically deposited in the silo to start earning compounding interest. Now you can take, within the silo, convert your deposited beans into deposited LP tokens, but the protocol doesn't do that automatically. It gives out bean seigniorage, not LP token seigniorage.
It's awesome, nevertheless, because of the gas costs that you earn bean automatically or on bean automatically, and then you can do with it whatever you like later down the road.
Once you earn the beans, they're yours.
Yep, exactly. So maybe we can touch upon the exploit now, if you guys are fine with it. So it happened like 10, 12 days ago or something like that. I know it was Sunday, because I actually just came to my mother-in-law for lunch, and as I was literally about to sit down at the table, a friend pinged me on Discord, said, "Hey Boyan, was Beanstalk just hacked?" And he sent a nice screenshot with big fat zero liquidity from Curve, and yeah, that was not too much fun. But yeah, maybe you can give your view of what went down there and how the exploit happened in the first place.
Eerily similar experience finding out. We're on a little earlier time zone, so it was waking up and seeing a similar message and then checking the liquidity on Curve and Uniswap, and how many more additional data points do you need to realize? Fuck. So
which was also your first, which was also, sorry for interrupting, which was also your first post on Discord past the exploit, which I think you said we're fucked or something along those lines.
Yeah. Yes, and at the time it really felt that way, and we've always tried to be open and honest with everyone, and that's certainly what it felt like at the time. Now at this point, it does not feel that way one bit, but that was a low. So what actually happened? In practice, there was a governance exploit via a flash loan attack, and the attacker used a very sophisticated basically strategy to obscure as much as possible their malicious intent up until the very moment of attack. So how did they do that? The attacker proposed 2 Beanstalk improvement proposals on Saturday. So they bought and deposited a little over $200,000 or beans in the silo in order to acquire enough stock to propose BIPs. And they then proposed 2 BIPs. And the BIPs that they proposed were almost identical. The first BIP referenced an Ethereum address that was blank and prior to that point in time had no history whatsoever. And then the second BIP, there were 2 BIPs, BIP 18 and 19. BIP 19 looked identical, except it referenced an Ethereum address that did have a history. And at the BIP, the address that BIP 19 referenced was a file that was registered on Etherscan as BIP18.sol. And BIP18.sol proposed donating 250,000 beans to the Ukraine. And so it looked pretty stupid, and in short, made it appear like the original proposal was a mistake. BIP 18 was a mistake that referenced the wrong address, and then they reproposed it as BIP 19 to reference the correct address. And then 24 hours later, because there was a 24-hour pause in the protocol between when BIPs are proposed and when they can be committed, which the original intent behind that was that people would have the opportunity, if there was a BIP that they didn't like, to acquire stock and participate in governance. But after the 24-hour period, BIPs can be proposed via a supermajority of 2/3 of the total stock. And so after the 24-hour period, the attacker borrowed via a flash loan $1 billion from Aave, used those $1 billion to acquire enough LP tokens and whitelisted assets to deposit them all in the silo and acquire more than 2/3 of the total stock. And that facilitated them to pass whatever, both or one of the BIPs if they wanted to. And in practice, what they did was they used their supermajority stock to execute and commit BIP 18. And at the exact same time as they took out the flash loan, they deployed the malicious code to the previously blank Ethereum address referenced in BIP 18 using the create2 opcode. And in short, that allows for the deployment of code at a deterministic address. And therefore, they were able to deploy the attack to the address referenced in BIP 18 that prior to the attack was totally blank. And so the malicious code itself was only deployed at the moment of attack. And the malicious code facilitated the withdrawal of all of the assets from the silo from Beanstalk, which then the attacker was able to withdraw all of the liquidity and the non-Beanstalk value, and then washed it through Tornado Cash almost immediately. So that's in a nutshell how the attack happened. And obviously the result is that Beanstalk is currently out a little under $77 million of non-Beanstalk value.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for the deep dive. That was quite indeed the Trojan horse, one must say. But to better understand it, I want to ask a question from a different viewpoint. What should have been done? What could have been done to catch this process and to prevent it? Was there something, or what do you think about it?
Well, in hindsight, it's very hard to say, right? Because at this point in time, it's one of those things. There's potentially an infinite number of different things shoulda, coulda, woulda. And so the reality is, I think it's a more productive conversation to talk about going forward, how to prevent anything like this from ever happening again, right? And even Vitalik was weighing in on Twitter around this discussion and basically said that token-based governance is not a good solution under any circumstances. And we take criticisms like that very seriously. And so the point is, for the short term, we don't think it makes sense. And this has been a discussion within the community. Generally, there doesn't seem to be any desire to rush back into on-chain governance over the short period of time. So in the short term, Beanstalk will be governed by a community-run multi-sig. And the hope is that over a longer period of time, a more robust decentralized governance mechanism can be implemented. But, there's no rush to implement that and have that anything like this happen again. And so anything that would be implemented as decentralized governance, hopefully in the not too distant future, will be once, twice, or thrice audited prior to anything ever going live on mainnet.
Very well. And apart from the multi-sig, what measures or what things are you going to implement once Beanstalk relaunches?
So, well, in practice, it's important to note that the exploit itself was an exploit on the governance, the decentralized governance of Beanstalk. And so temporarily, the whole of on-chain governance has been removed, which to a large extent removes the vast majority of potential attack vectors, and certainly the vast majority of potential deadly attack vectors, if that makes sense. So in the grand scheme of things, from a risk perspective, the short term is that there's, at least in theory, a dramatically different risk profile now that there's not on-chain governance for the time being, and think that should be a very good short-term solution. Now, it's also important to note, even though obviously it wasn't enough. Beanstalk has been audited, and there is something to be said for the vast majority of the code has been audited, and therefore, you know, with the hope of there's a Halborn audit starting in a little over a week. There's a Trail of Bits audit starting in a little over a month. The hope is to get a lot of different data points that people can start to feel confident in the security of the protocol. But in the long run, the only thing that can really give true data points that the protocol is secure is being out there in the wild with a lot of value and surviving, right? And so this is in practice, no number of audits can necessarily give people the any sort of guarantee. This is kind of the nature of the beast of having open source technology and open source systems. So this is the way it is.
Right. Let's do not dwell on that any longer than necessary. And I wanted to look a little bit towards the future, towards your fundraiser, and just give a brief intro before I pass the word over to you. So after the exploit, after I finished my lunch, I logged in onto the Discord, and we had the usual comments of devs rocked, well done, Publius, etc., etc. But to my amazement, that was just for, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes. And then all of a sudden, a group of users emerged and really changed the tide of conversation towards a much more productive area, so to say. And I don't know if the same day, but I think the same day already the ideas of a fundraise came up and VC money and whatnot. But I just wanted to say that I was really positively surprised by how the community handled it. And what's your take on how this came together, the fundraiser, and what is the fundraiser in first place?
Yeah. And we would echo that and say that we were similarly surprised and heavily enthused by the reaction from the community. And the idea for the barn raiser, I don't know where that name came from, but in practice, it was very clear by the response from the community and many of the people contributing to Beanstalk prior to the attack that this was something they were not willing to let die. And so the question then became, well, what is a path forward? And there was a lot of discussion over the first couple of days. A lot of it is recorded because it was town halls and DAO meetings or whatever. And there was a ton of questions and debate around the best way to structure it and the time and the incentives and yada, yada. It's endless what was discussed. But ultimately, over the week or so, people came to a general consensus of a structure, and it was put to a snapshot vote. The DAO voted, I think, unanimously. I think it was 100% to approve the proposal for the barn raise, which is really cool. And the barn raise is scheduled to start Monday, so May 2nd. So that's coming up in a couple days. So what is the barn raise, you ask? So Beanstalk fundamentally is out $77 million or so at the moment. And so the hope is to have the protocol's ability to attract lenders, which is the core to its ability to maintain peg or keep the bean price at its peg, lean into its ability to attract lenders and try to recuperate or recapitalize as much of that $77 million as possible. So in short, the protocol is going to issue over a 10-day period of time, which is called the barn raise, the equivalent of $77 million worth of debt effectively that people can lend to the protocol in exchange for pods. And for reference, pods are the debt asset of Beanstalk. And pods are typically paid on a first in, first out basis. In this
So,
case,
so just to recap, sorry, people will be able to deposit an asset and they will get pods in return, and there will be some interest on that pods, right?
well, I don't know if I would call it a deposit because you can't really withdraw. It's more of a, a loan in the sense of you're lending assets to the protocol, and in exchange, you're getting pods. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. And do you already know which token can be used or will be used for it?
It's unclear at the moment. There's a couple of conversations being had around what are the best tokens to raise this in potentially, and unclear at the moment.
Yeah, I think the ideal scenario would be to deposit some ETH into Liquity and borrow LUSD, which you would then, of course, enable for the barn raise. But that's a different topic. Just mentioning, by the way. What I wanted to mention as well is the barn raise will be for 10 days, right? But there will be 2 phases. Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So the first phase is the bidding phase, whereby people can place a bid for an amount at an interest rate. And the concept is that the protocol will start to accumulate bids, and the bids are effectively locked in. So the more bids that the protocol accumulates, the more capital that's committed to the barn raise. And that will happen for 7 days. And the main incentive to bid, Beanstalk will give a bonus the earlier that you bid. So I think the first day the bid is 21%, or the bonus is 21%, and then it decreases by 3% each day for 7 days. So 21, then 18, and so on. So that's the bidding period. And then the concept is that the next stage is the 3-day sowing period, whereby 2 things can happen. One, the weather will start at 20%. The interest rate will start at 20% and increase 1% every 10 minutes for 3 days, up to 452%. And the idea is that as the weather or the interest rate increases, the bids at each weather will fill and get into line. So if you bid 100%, whenever the weather gets to 100%, the bid will fill and you'll get placed in this line, which is, again, first in, first out. So the people that bid a lower amount are closer to the front of the line. Now, the second thing is, as this 3-day sowing period is happening, people can just get into line independent of whether they had bid previously or not, such that you'll have these bids that are expected to clear in a couple minutes, and people can then hop in front of line. So there's an incentive to participate in the bidding period. There's another separate incentive to participate in the sowing period, and the hope is that between the two, Beanstalk will be able to recapitalize as much of the $77 million as possible. So that's the first, the barn raise is the first phase, if you will. Now, the way we like to think about the structure of the relaunch is there's really 3 stages or phases. The barn raise, then you have the haircut. So one of the core principles of the barn raise structure, as we understand it, is that the protocol needs to be in a good position to succeed going forward, independent of the capital that it's able to recuperate. And so if it only raises 10% or 20% or 50% or 80%, not the full 100%, there needs to be a path forward for Beanstalk. And the concept is that the entire state of Beanstalk prior to the attack will be scaled by the percentage of capital that the protocol is able to raise. So this is the haircut. So there's the barn raise, then there's the haircut. And all of the beans, all the stock, all the seeds, all the value that was deposited in the silo, the LP tokens, all the pods, the entire state of Beanstalk prior to the attack will be scaled down by whatever percent the pod raise is able to raise. And that does a couple of very important things. One, it sets Beanstalk up to succeed going forward no matter what. Because prior to the attack, it was in a very healthy, at least economically speaking, a very healthy position. And so the idea is that the protocol will be in a very similar, albeit perhaps scaled down version, but a very similar state. And secondly, the idea is if you're at the beginning of the line, you don't have any guarantee per se, or you're one of the first bidders. You don't have any guarantee that somebody's going to bid after you and come in behind you. And there's a concern that if you've only got 1 million or you're at 10 million of the 77, that you're now bailing out or trying to come and recapitalize this whole huge, massive system, and it's too small, right? And you don't want to be the one bailing out the whole system. So in practice, in order to align the incentives between the people that are coming and lending to the protocol and recapitalizing it with the long-term the long-term success of Beanstalk, independent of how much capital it's able to raise, that's what the haircut does in practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to mention that the fundraiser is also meant to make whole the LP providers which were in the silo before that, and I think also the pot holders. Is that correct? So those people have an incentive to that it succeeds as well.
Exactly. And the more that the barn raises, the less of the haircut. Now, there's also a third phase of this, which is the vesting. So one of the big questions, and it's a very reasonable question if you're lending to the protocol now, is, well, if somebody had $100,000 or $1 million in the protocol prior to the attack, and now it's worth $0, and all of a sudden it's worth 100% again, people may be very well inclined to take their money and leave, if you know what I mean. And so the question is, well, how to align the new lenders with the old Beanstalk members such that they're not providing exit liquidity. And so in addition to the haircut, there's the third phase, which is the vesting schedule. And the concept is that the liquid assets in the system, which are the beans, the deposited LP tokens, these assets that were in the system and were valuable but are now valueless after the attack, that are being recapitalized, they will be subject to a vesting schedule, whereby the percentage of the assets that people can claim, according to this proposal, is a function of the percentage of the debt, the pods that are issued during the barn raiser that have been paid back. So let's say the barn raiser issues 300 million pods. If 100 million of those 300 million pods have been harvested or paid back by the protocol, then the beans or the deposited beans with the deposited LP tokens, if they want to claim and exit the system, they're entitled to a third of their value. So if they had $1,000, it's recapitalized, so they have $500, and now they want to claim it, they would only be entitled to a third of it, and they didn't be entitled to 500 if they waited until the full 300 million pods were paid back, and that assumes a 50% haircut. So that's just one example of how this could play out. But at a macro level, the idea is that the vesting schedule makes it such that it's highly improbable that there's any significant sell pressure from the previous holders into the new lenders.
And those people who do leave, what happens with the leftover funds they leave behind?
A great question. It is going to be basically distributed to the other people that are waiting. So there's a nice game of chicken here where the people that are getting recapitalized and believe in the long-term success of Beanstalk, they're inclined to just wait it all out because they're going to get maybe even a bonus for other people rage quitting effectively.
All right, cool. And I'd have another question about the race itself. So we are looking, or you guys are looking for 77 million, and there will be a bidding, so a competition going on. If the round is oversubscribed, theoretically, you could not get anything, right? If your bid is too high.
Correct.
All right, just wanted to make sure. And one last question about the first phase, about the bidding phase. For example, if you join on day 2, you would be entitled to 18%. If you then later change your bid, does that decrease your percentage, or is that locked in?
It depends if you change it on a later day. If you change it on day 2, it doesn't, but on day 3 or day 4, your bonus would reset.
Yeah, I meant on a later day. Okay, cool. That's makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that was it from my side. Would you maybe want to share anything, or should we open it up to the audience for any questions?
Let's open it up briefly. We do have another call at the top of the hour, which we can be a little late for, but let's see if there's a couple questions.
Okay.
Bojan, I gave you're now a co-host, so you can invite anyone up to speak. Anybody who raises their hand, I believe you can bring them on stage. Publius, I'll do the same for you. What's up, Caesar?
Hello there.
My most favorite stablecoin projects at the same time. I've been a long time fan of Liquity, and I've been a fan of Bean since they've arrived. So I have a question more for you at Liquity, and that is, I was wondering about any of the feedback about how is your community feeling about the ability to migrate from the stability pool to the Bean ecosystem. Did you hear anybody speaking about this or any feedback in this sense? And you get the question, I think.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. One issue is that our integration happened just shortly before the exploit itself. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we didn't do any marketing efforts, etc. However, we do have a couple of long-term Liquity supporters who did bring up Beanstalk on our Discord. So things were picking up slowly, as Publius mentioned, but unfortunately were cut short a bit prematurely. But once things launch up again, I'm positive that we'll get things going again.
Awesome, thank you. And that's it for me, guys.
Sweet. Thanks, Caesar. Anyone else have a question? Want to come on stage? Hey, Arnaud.
Hello, I'm from France. I use Liquidity to use the LP LUSD beans, and I would like to know if the bean token will be peg or you will launch a new stablecoin.
It will have to be a new Bean token, so it'll be a new ERC20 token.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think it's Twitter himself now.
Yeah, hi. Yes, recently I saw some
there.
tweets from Binance saying that they had frozen funds from the Ronin exploit, and I just saw a tweet from Deus DAO saying that Binance froze funds from their exploit, and both of those exploits, the attacker used Tornado. So I was wondering if you'd contacted Binance.
Well, the short answer is we've reached out to a lot of different exchanges, and we're also trying to coordinate with a lot of different trackers of funds. And if there's any, news or relevant evidence that the funds have been transferred to exchanges, I think that that'll be addressed when that happens. But all of that's being taken very seriously across the board.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions? Feel free to ask. All right. That seems like that's all the questions, but this was awesome. This was super informative. Bojan, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add or plug from the Liquity side before we wrap up, but this was really great.
I mean, not really. If the Beanstalk guys have any questions about Liquity, they should just come over to our Discord. We're very active there. And if our users have any questions about Beanstalk, because the terminology is indeed a bit of a handful, they have nice dogs and friendly people as well. So just come by.
Totally. Yeah. Anyone who wants to learn more, feel free to just hit us up on Twitter, join the Discord. Yeah, always happy to share more.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys. And good luck with the race.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time. Talk soon.